Rock Ministries. I'm Dr. Craig Hines, and today we will continue our discussion on Jacob. So let's turn in our Bibles to Genesis chapter 28, verse 18, and we will pick up our discussion there on Jacob. So Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put under his head. And this stone he set up as a pillar and poured oil on the top of the pillar. Jacob called the name of the place Bethel. However, previously the name of the place had been Luz, L-U-Z. Let me give you a little bit of a geographical description of what part of the Holy Land this was in. Bethel was about 10 miles north of Jerusalem and about 60 miles north of Beersheba, where Jacob left his family. So he'd already traveled about 60 miles after he left Isaac and Rebekah. This was also where Abraham had made one of his first sacrifices to God when he entered into the land of Canaan. At first, in the earlier days, Bethel had been an important center for worship. Later, it became a center for idol worship. And in fact, one of the prophets, Hosea, condemned its evil practices, as we'll see later on when we study the prophets. Verse 20, Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take, and will give me food and garments to wear, and I'm able to return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. The stone which I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and all of you will surely give me, and surely all that you give me, I will give you a tenth, O Lord. Okay, so let's talk about this for a minute. God promises to give Jacob protection. God promises to give Jacob provision. He also promises to give Jacob blessing and success. He promises to return Jacob to the land of Canaan. And then Jacob responds to all of these promises by vowing that if God is with him, and that if God does provide him food, and if God does provide him clothing, then he will return to Canaan, and return him to Canaan, and the Lord would be his God. Now, when you look at this at first glance, it seems like a rather self-centered bargain. It seems like Jacob is playing a quid pro quo arrangement here. It sounds as if Jacob has several other gods in the running to be his God. The one that meets his needs will receive the honor of being Jacob's God. This actually implies that on its face, that if God does not meet Jacob's demands, Jacob will not accept the Lord as his God. Now, there's a problem with all of this, and the problem is with the English translation itself. The Hebrew does actually say, "Then the Lord will be my God." It does not say that. It actually says, "And the Lord will be my God." Not, "Then the Lord will be my God." It says, "And the Lord will be my God." The sense of the passage is that if God provides for Jacob and returns Jacob to Canaan and will be a God to Jacob, then Jacob will fulfill the vow that he utters in verse 22, which is, "The stone which I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and all that you have given me, I will surely give a tenth of it to you." Now, when you look at it from this perspective, it makes much more sense. It's not, when you take the word "then" out and you put in "and," it's not a quid pro quo arrangement. But what does he mean by saying, "If the Lord will be my God"? It means simply this. Jacob desires a personal relationship with God that is on the same level that his father Isaac had with God and that his grandfather Jacob had with God. he wanted to be able to enjoy that kind of a relationship like his father and his grandfather before him. Jacob wanted to know and to be known by God. Just as the Lord had been the God of Abraham and Isaac, Jacob now desired that the God of Jacob, that he would be the God of Jacob as well. Jacob is committing himself to a deeper relationship with God. And he promises to show his gratitude for this wonderful relationship by giving him 1/10 of his possessions. Now, many people approach God with an attitude of entitlement. Well, if God will answer my prayers and if God will meet my demands, then I will favor God with the great privilege of accepting God. Now, I must quite frankly state that is a terrible way to approach our God. That would be like a wife saying to her husband, if you give me the things that I want, then I will let you be my husband. Now, we need to think about that a minute. The husband is already her husband. And the Lord himself does not beg us for our affirmation. And the person who properly understands their place in the scheme of things is not going to lay ground rules for God anyway. It doesn't work that way. We should love God. We should accept God. We should trust God, and we should obey God because He is God, not because He meets our requests. He's not some genie in a bottle where we rub on a lamp and make 3 wishes. He is already our God, with or without our approval, and there is nothing we have to offer Him. If we willingly commit ourselves to God, no strings attached, He will certainly be our God just as He was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let's now turn in our Bibles to Genesis chapter 29. We're going to go now into the next chapter, and we're going to start in that next chapter with verse 1. Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the sons of the east. And he looked, and he saw a well in the field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep were lying there beside it, and from the well that they watered their flocks. Now the stone on the mouth of the well was large, and when all were gathered there, they would then roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep. They would then put the stone back in its place on the mouth of the well. And Jacob, as he's approaching this situation, he says to them, "My brothers, where are you from?" And they say, "We are from Haran." Then he said to them, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" And they responded by telling Jacob the following, "We know him." And Jacob said to them, "Is it well with him?" And they responded, "It is well with him." And here is Rachel, his daughter, coming with their sheep. And he said, "Behold, it is still high day. It is not time for livestock to be gathered. Water the sheep and go pasture them." But these sons of the east said, "We cannot until all of the flocks are gathered. And once they are gathered, we can roll the stone from the mouth of the well, and then we can water the sheep." And while Jacob was still speaking to them, and I'm just finding it's easier to paraphrase this in first and third person, by the way. While Jacob was still speaking to them, Rachel came up with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. And when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, who was his mother's brother, in other words, Rachel is his cousin, Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the mouth of the well and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted his voice and wept. Jacob told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and that he was Rebekah's son. In other words, he's basically saying, I'm your cousin. So when Laban heard the news of Jacob, his sister's son, his nephew, if you will, he ran to meet him. And he embraced Jacob, and he kissed Jacob, and he brought Jacob to his house. Then Jacob related to Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. So Jacob stayed with Laban and the family for a month, and then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be? When Jacob arrived in Haran, he came upon some shepherds that were waiting to water their flocks. You know, we see this in the verses that I just read. And Jacob at this point inquires about his relatives, and he's informed by these shepherds that are gathered there that Rachel, his cousin, was approaching with a flock of her own to be watered. At that point, Jacob then rolls the stone off the well and he waters the flocks himself. Then he kissed Rachel and he wept aloud. Now, imagine the scene from Rachel's perspective. Strange man comes up out of nowhere, waters her flocks. Then this strange man comes up to her. Not only does he come up to her, he kisses her and he starts to cry. What could she do? What could she do but fall in love? Now, let me state something here. Jacob's kiss should not be misinterpreted. He is not some sort of a lecherous man trying to take advantage of a pretty girl at a particular vulnerable moment or anything. This is the reality of the situation. He is at the end of a long and difficult journey. And when he encounters Rachel, his cousin, his future bride, the daughter of Laban, as if by chance, he knows and he realizes this is the hand of God. This is God's sovereign work. Because he knows the story of how Eleazar had, if by coincidence, encountered his own mother Rebekah upon his arrival in Haran. And once again we see, as if by coincidence, Jacob too has now encountered a girl of Laban's household. A clear token that God was expecting him and directing his paths. This is the reason why Jacob wept for joy. And this is the reason why Jacob kissed her as one might kiss a relative. Because we're going to see a few verses later, Laban kisses Jacob as well. And even though these kisses do have an even deeper significance, Jacob's first recorded kiss in the Torah was a kiss of deceit as well, when he was disguised as Esau. We saw this back in Genesis chapter 27, verses 26 and 27, when Isaac asked Jacob to come close and kiss him. And ever since that kiss, Jacob had been on the run. Now, when he kisses Rachel, it's as if that particular chapter, that chapter of deception, if you will, has now been closed in his life. But what we're going to find out as we study the next few chapters, that was not the case at all. The truth of the matter is, he was about to taste the kiss of deceit himself from his uncle Laban. Now, we see here that at first in our readings of Genesis regarding Jacob and Laban, we see at first that Laban receives him warmly, or at least seems to be receiving him warmly. But then in the end, we see Laban deceive him and take advantage of him, not just momentarily, but for 2 solid decades. Verse 16. Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel's eyes were beautiful of form, and she was beautiful of form and face. Now Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. And Laban replied, it is better that I give her to you than to give her to another man. So stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed but a few to him. A few days, that is, because of his love for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my time is completed, that I may go to her. So Laban gathered all the men of the palace and made a feast. Now in the evening, Laban took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob went in to her. Laban also gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter as a maid. So it came about in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, what is this that you have done to me? Why was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why have you deceived me? And at this point, Laban replies, it is not the practice in our place to marry off the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other daughter also for the service which you shall serve me for another 7 years. So we see deception number 1 now by Laban. Let us continue. So Jacob did so and completed his week, and Laban gave his daughter Rachel to Jacob as his wife as well. And Laban also gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Laban as well. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and indeed he loved Rachel more than Leah. And he served with Laban another 7 years. I'm trying to let all that soak in, because it's kind of like, are you pondering what I'm pondering moment. What we see here is Laban has 2 daughters, Rachel and Leah. We know Leah is the older because that's what the Torah says about it. But also the Torah tells us that she has weak eyes, and Rachel, on the other hand, was beautiful. So what does it mean that Leah had weak eyes? Does that mean she was nearsighted? She was blind? What does it mean? Well, when you translate the Hebrew word that's similar to weak, it can also mean delicate. It can also mean tender or soft. And in fact, some translations of the Hebrew understand it in the sense of beautiful eyes. And I pretty much subscribe to that being the case. The Torah would be saying, if you take it that way, that Leah had beautiful eyes, but Rachel had a beautiful figure and face. Leah had beautiful eyes, but was not as attractive as Rachel's, but is what they're kindly saying here. Now, Laban had switched his daughters on the wedding night simply because he wanted to get another 7 years of work out of Jacob. That was his ulterior motive. Now, you're probably thinking, well, how can you execute such a swap? Well, the reality is executing such a swap in that day wouldn't have been that difficult, because it was the custom in the ancient world that the bride would be completely veiled and would be in very extravagant dress and quite frankly unrecognizable. Her unveiling would be happening in the bridal chamber in total darkness as well. And that's a reason today we see in many weddings where brides wear a veil on their wedding day. And the groom, prior to the ceremony, is allowed to lift the veil to make sure that he is marrying the right girl. That's where this comes from when you go to a wedding where the bride's completely veiled and then the groom uncovers her. Jacob's accidental marriage to Leah is a good example, however, of how God works in our lives. You know, we make plans, we dream dreams, and we set out to accomplish certain things. And then all of a sudden our plans are frustrated, all of a sudden our dreams come to naught, and all of a sudden we find ourselves far away from our original goals. Now, having said that, that does not mean that God has abandoned us. It just means that your plans for your life may not be His plans for your life. God may be attempting to work something great in your life through your situation that you never even expected. But we see through Leah that Jacob sires Judah and Levi, who in turn fathers the line of David and the kings, the Davidic lineage that leads to Jesus Christ. And then we see the line of Aaron and the priests, which also is a lineage to Jesus Christ. So we shouldn't be too concerned either about Jacob's polygamy. In fact, Jacob's polygamy was common in that day and culturally accepted. Even Abraham, the man of faith and friend of God, practiced polygamy. And I'll go even further and tell you that it is not a violation of God's law, but neither is it His ideal. Monogamy is the Bible's ideal, because when we go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, it states, male and female, He created them. So He's talking about one male, one female. So monogamy is the model. Now let's talk a little bit about ideal families. Quite frankly, there are few ideal families in the Bible, and quite frankly as well, Jacob's family certainly was not ideal. And as if it wasn't bad enough to have two wives, they're sisters. And being married, and not only that, they're married to the same man, which makes them even more bitter rivals. And this makes for a dysfunctional combination that the Torah later legislates against sisters marrying the same man. The sisters added to the dysfunction by offering Jacob their maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah. And basically they perform nothing more as additional baby makers in this baby making derby, the contest to bear sons. Jacob's family is far from ideal, yet his children are the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise. His children are quite literally the children of Israel. What this teaches us is that God is able to work and chooses to work His purposes in less than ideal conditions. And even as we look today at broken marriages and broken families and second marriages that are very common, we know that these are not ideal situations, but we also know that God can work with even the worst circumstances. God is the being who brings order out of the chaos and shines light into the darkness. And it is in this less than ideal situation, Jacob, in God's way of multiplying his seed and keeping the promises made to Abraham. It occurs in spite of all this craziness. This multiplication of the children of Israel. Verse 31. Now the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. The Torah says that Rachel was unloved. The Hebrew actually uses a stronger word. It says that Rachel was hated. And that kind of begs the question, how could that be? How could she be hated? I mean, after all, Jacob went on to sire 6 sons through Leah. Well, what I want to talk about next may shed some light on this issue, which is a difficult saying from Luke 14:26 from Jesus. Jesus tells us that if anyone comes to him and does not hate his mother and his father and his wife and his sisters and his brothers and his children, and yes, even their own lives, those persons cannot be one of his disciples. Now, at first brush, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, after all, shouldn't discipleship to Jesus encourage us to love our family members? Secondly, doesn't the Bible teach us to honor our parents? Doesn't the Bible teach us to love our spouses? Doesn't the Bible teach us to love our children? So, how can Jesus tell us that we need to hate our family in order to be a disciple? Here's the answer. In Hebrew, the word hate is not absolute. Sometimes it simply shows an order of preference. Jesus is not saying in Luke that in order for us to be his disciples, or what he is saying to us actually, is that we need to prioritize our commitment to him. Okay? And that commitment is we need to have our commitment to him over that of our family members. We're not supposed to hate our family, but he comes first. God is first, our family and friends are second, and we should be third. Book by Gail Sayers. I highly recommend you read it. We need to devote first to him, to God, and second to our families. Now that makes a lot more sense. After all, when he called the 12 disciples, they had to leave their careers, at least to focus on those careers and on their families, to follow him. Matthew 10:37 tells us that he who loves his mother or father more than they love Jesus is not worthy of Jesus. There is no better way then to properly love our family members than by placing our first and highest love with Jesus. Because when we do that, we find the source of perfect love from which we can lavish love onto our families. By following Jesus, we learned how to properly love our families and our spouses and our children. Plainly then, Jesus does not ask us to hate our families, but to put him first. And the bottom line is this. Even back in the Old Testament, what this whole thing is saying to us is that Jacob loved Rachel more than he loved Leah. Amen and amen. Have a blessed week. May God protect you and keep you. Amen.